Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of our in-service podcast here at Service Council. I am Gerardo Pelayo, Chief Research Officer, and I'm very glad today to have Adi Frenkenberg. She's the Senior Customer Success Manager with Aquant, here with me to talk about a very refreshing angle of a very frequent conversation that we have in the industry, which is going to be AI adoption when behavior drives or derails success. Now, before we get into that and we'll get to know Adi well over the next 25, 30 minutes, I want to go through a little bit of housekeeping, reminding everybody that today's podcast is going to be recorded so you can go back and access it, revisit it, share it with your friends. We always like you to be not just a listening audience, but a participating audience. If you're watching us on LinkedIn, we see you, and you can comment. We'll try to incorporate those ideas or questions that you might have into the conversation. But getting into the matter, I was thinking how to get across the point that this is so important and not be considered on the soft side, and which sometimes has some negative connotations. And getting a little bit personal, I have a son that's just shy of a year and a half. And it's interesting. One of the things that you very quickly learn is that no matter how tasty the food is or how nutritious it is, how good it's going to be for his health and his well-being, if it's not presented in the right way, if it's not presented when he's hungry, if we don't meet him with the right fork, the right spoon, sometimes the right finger, it's not going to fly. It's not going to achieve anything. It's going to go to waste. And sometimes it's cheap food. Sometimes it could be expensive food. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. It ends up in the same place. And little by little, one of the ways in which we've been able to bridge this gap is by paying attention to the signals, right? And trying to listen to not just what he says or mumbles, but how he moves and how he reacts, and when do we anticipate that he's hungry, and try to build a routine around that. And all of that might sound very simple, but yet I know many in the community have kids or have nephews, nieces themselves. And this simple example, I wonder if we're making a little bit of that mistake when we think about incorporating technology, incorporating best practices into our day-to-day, especially when we're trying to impose those things with the best intentions, but include that for our teams. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we get smarter about that? How do we put a little bit more structure than my very trivial example? But that's why we have Adi to walk us through that path today. So I've had the pleasure of not just meet you during the planning sessions, but I've been following your content and your insights on LinkedIn. I do recommend the audience to follow her as well. You'll enjoy it. But Adi, would you mind giving everybody a little bit of background about yourself and what do you do at Aquant?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gerardo, and thanks for having me. So I'm Adi Frenkenberg. I'm a Senior Customer Success Manager at Aquant, where I actually help enterprises, and primarily in manufacturing and medical devices and heavy equipment, to navigate AI adoption. And I say navigate deliberately because the technical side of this is rarely where organizations struggle, right? So the human side is where success is actually determined. So alongside my work at Aquant, I lecture at Reichman University on the behavioral science of AI adoption. And the combination of obviously is intentional, right? I've come to believe that you really need both legs to stand on, because the field without theory is just anecdote, and the theory without field is just an abstraction. So bringing them together is where the real insights lives. And I've been in this space for about 4 years now. And what keeps me here is something I've witnessed repeatedly. So across very different organizations with very different cultures, I see that when adoption truly works, it doesn't just change processes, it changes people. So the way they see their own expertise, the way they collaborate, the way they show up at work, that's what drives me. And that's, I guess, the lens I will be bringing to our conversation today.
Yeah, perfect. That's a great introduction. Adi, thank you very much. And one of the things that probably will surprise you close to nothing is that, but it's still important to have the data point. Uh, we go out and ask service leaders at the beginning of every year what's in their agenda, and 88% of them, essentially almost all of them, say that they expect the role of AI and digital technology, the enabling role across their service organization to increase during 2026. And I say it's going to be a little surprised because that's the talk every day, right?
Mhm.
But that usually goes around the capabilities that you need, and you raised an important point with these psychological elements. In your opinion, is the greatest challenge when it comes to adoption of these capabilities, is it technological or is it psychological, and why?
Well, I gotta say it's overwhelmingly psychological, and I'll tell you why. And obviously, that's not a throwaway answer, right? The technology side has come a long way. So the platforms are capable, the models are capable, and integrations now became extremely mature. It's extremely easy to do. But the remaining challenge in AI adoption isn't really technical. It's whether organizations can actually, absorb and adapt, and that's the human layer. And that's where almost every implementation struggles. So what makes it psychological rather than technical is that AI actually asks people to renegotiate things technology usually doesn't touch, right? Their expertise, their identity, their sense of what makes them valuable at work. So that's fundamentally different conversation than please learn this new tool, right? With the old CRM systems, which is why I tell organizations really early that isn't your typical SaaS implementation. It requires a three-headed creature. Someone who understands your data, someone who understands your operations and your people. So all three heads need to be in the room because no single one, not a single one of them sees the full picture alone, right? And if you scope those kind of projects only as technological project, you will solve the easy part, but you'll skip the hard part.
Yeah, I agree. Clearly, from my example at the top, but maybe a way to just emphasize one of the points that you said. It's technology is necessary. By no means we're discarding that, but it's not sufficient in order to really drive change to get to the extent of what is possible, and that sufficiency. That's where the psychological aspect comes in. Now, as I was learning more about you, one of the things that I came across was that you co-authored this very interesting article. It's scary to use it. It's scary to refuse it. If I'm quoting it correctly, around the psychological dimensions of AI adoption. Now, I'm sure you could fill the whole podcast with the findings of that, but are there any highlights from it that surprised you, in particular, any results that you were not anticipating?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. So the article, which I co-authored with my supervisor, Professor Guy Hoffman, came out of something we kept observing, right? People were anxious about using AI, but they were also anxious about not using AI. And I think this is something we can see also over LinkedIn, right? People keep posting on their AI usage on a daily basis. So they're anxious about using it and they're anxious about not using it. So there's kind of no neutral ground to it. And that's the tension actually the titles try to capture. And the finding that surprised me most is that AI usage and anxiety aren't actually linearly related, right? You would expect that as you continue to use that, the anxiety will probably drop, right? But we actually found it's U-shaped. So moderate engagement reduces anxiety, and that part we expected, but the high levels of usage, right, at the both ends of the spectrum, this is where anxiety actually climbs back up. So the lowest anxiety zone isn't just use it, instead of using it as much as possible. This is not a very good recommendation based on what we found. The actual findings should guide us to find a balanced engagement. And for field service adoption, that's a meaningful reframe, right? Because we tend to measure success by pure usage. And what the data actually suggests is that maximum usage isn't the healthiest state. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that go ahead.
Yeah, just to say that underneath like the whole study is a framework that matters for anyone who is leading this work, right? So AI anxiety has two layers. This is something that we need to keep in mind. There's the surface layer. This is something that we read in the papers about, right? About job loss, about complexity and stuff. But the deeper layer about the erosion of what makes your expertise yours, right? For senior field engineers, the resistance we see is rarely about the tool itself. It's actually about the second layer, what it will do to your expertise and to your professional identity.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. You are generating reactions not just in myself, but I see John Carroll, my colleague, also calling out this symbiosis that needs to exist, right? Like the interrelationship between it's humans and technology, not having to choose one over the other, and just supplementing that comment on how being smart about that coevolution, which I think you're shining a light on. It's not a nice to have, but it's something that is necessary for service organizations to be successful and to even exist in the near and middle term. One of the reactions I had just briefly on one of the things you mentioned is because it's very counterintuitive that the more that you use it, anxiety starts going back up, right? And one of the things that we've heard, that I've heard from the community, is also this loss of accountability and the loss of ownership of a process that starts to appear once AI is used in excess, and therefore one might start to wonder, well, where is my value, and how am I going to be valuable for the organization in the middle and the long term? So very interesting findings there, and if we take a step back and look not just at the individual's reaction, but how then they behave within the concept of an organization and the organizational maturity. One of the interesting things in the last response that we got from the state of AI and service technology is that a third of the respondents said that the reason for them putting a stop or slowing down their efforts to implement AI with a partner had to do with a feeling that they didn't have the internal talent to leverage the AI capabilities. And so can you share a little bit of your comments, maybe some experience that you've had with the customers, on what is it about the organizational nuance that actually matters for the adoption of AI? I mean, there's you started talking about the size of the teams, the expertise. What would you say are the key elements there?
So I'm not sure the key elements are necessarily like the size or the team count or the expertise level, right? This it matters operationally, but they're not the real where the real adoption variance lives. So I think that the nuance that actually matter sits in two levels. So at the individual level, right, the strongest predictor of how someone will respond to AI isn't their age, isn't their title, it's not even their technical background, even though we would expect that, right? It's actually their tenure in their current role. So someone with been doing the same job for 15 years has built their professional identity around a specific way of working, right? They show up every day to work, they expect to do the same thing or something along the same lines. And AI doesn't just ask them to learn a new tool, it asks them to renegotiate the value, exactly like what you just said. That's a fundamentally different psychological challenge than just learning a software. On the other end, if you got a 6 months hire, right? He or she obviously hasn't established any identity to protect. So they're still figuring out their role. So AI is just part of their landscape. And at the organizational level, the nuance is the composition, I would say, of the team leading this initiative. So not necessarily the size of it, not necessarily the budget, it's the composition. So you gotta have like the three, I call it like the three-headed creature, right? So you gotta have those three, which I mentioned earlier, which is the data, the operation, and the people, actually in one room, because otherwise, if you're missing one of them, you will struggle, right? But if you're missing two of them, you will actually fail. So, which is why saying like we have limited internal AI talent, right, isn't necessarily a blocker. It's actually a signal to partner more carefully together.
Yeah, and so I loved your answer. One of the reasons being this different focus from what we see every day on like this more shallow analysis, which is everything is determined by the age bracket that you're in and the generation that you belong, and therefore the behaviors that you're going to have. I also like it because that's the same result that we got in our Voice of the Frontline research last year, where that how long you've been at the organization in the role was a much better source of explanation for some of the things that we didn't even expect. So yes, the quality of the training, the quality of the onboarding, the clarity of the processes, but then some of the other more outer elements of the employee experience, like your satisfaction with the salary and the benefits, or the influence that data and technology have on your level of mental stress. So the reasons behind that you're eliminating some of it as well, but I think this is no minor thing, because as service leaders build this learning structures, think about how to reskill and upskill their teams. It's not just about getting the young ones with the old ones, or having separate programs depending on their age bracket. It's really that nuance that we're talking about here that should orient those efforts in order to get a better outcome there. Now, I mean, some might say that we've just made the problem bigger. That the challenges that service leaders were thinking about, all of a sudden, like the size of that pie has increased. So let's talk a little bit about how to deal with that larger pie, and in order to put some structure, sort of like eating our own Kool-Aid in this fun conversation. Let's talk about how do you get started with AI, and one of the elements that I might start to create some segments, building on this same research that I just spoke about, is roughly a third of the participants define themselves as either slow adopters or laggards when it came to their own organizational capabilities around AI. So for those where that expertise doesn't may not exist, you might have a lone champion at best. Is there any advice that you would offer these type of service organizations in order to how to get started on this train?
Yeah, so the first thing I tell organizations is you don't need a perfect setup, right, to start. You just need a foothold, something to start with. And what I mean is you should identify like one workflow, right? One moment in the field service engineer's day where the friction is real, and the friction is actually visible. Not necessarily the most complex problem, but actually the most felt problem. Because when you solve something people actually experience as painful, adoption will follow organically. So they will tell each other, word spreads. Word usually tends to spread faster than any formal training initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that don't wait for a dedicated team, right? In most organizations with limited resources, adoption succeeds because one person decided to own it, and that is usually sufficient. So, and not because you don't necessarily need a committee to create that. So when you have that person who is, and that person is usually someone from within the organization, but the actual job is to recognize them, right, and give them the space to lead. And the third thing, which I see in many organizations, is that, or what organizations lose the most time, is don't underestimate the fundamentals, right? Manager visibility, like consistent touch points, tracking usage, but as a feedback loop, not just as something that you need to monitor because you implemented AI. And learn by that what's working, what isn't, who needs support. That doesn't require any budget, right? It just requires intention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree, and I'll double click on that by sort of like taking a little bit of a creative freedom building on your article. But you were calling out this U shape, right? When too little and too much are both represent a problem. And some might say, well, AI getting started is going to be very challenging if you have very little resources. But the more resources you have, and if you have like this strong foundation and a group of experts, then life should be easy breezy. And I have my own point of view, but I'd like to get your take on it first. Are there challenges as well on the other side of the spectrum, and how same as you just stressed for those that are getting started, how should an organization that has this higher level of maturity, more resources, more expertise, how should they think about starting on this AI experience?
So this is actually one of the most, if you have this experts, right, AI experts. So how should I say that? It's actually one of the most interesting population to work with, right? If you have those expertise, those AI experts. Because the challenge with them are almost like the opposite of what less mature organizations would face. So the first pattern I see, this is something I came up with recently, is that I think like they have the AI powder problem, right? Those teams have real internal fluency, right? And they love the technology, and they want to put AI on everything, basically. They assume that AI would solve everything. So, but what gets skipped in that process is the discovery, right? The research, like the honest analysis of what are the actual pain points that they need to solve. They fall in love with the solution even before they've defined the problem. And AI applied to a wrong problem isn't fast. It's just wrong, but actually faster wrong. So and the second problem is actually more subtle. In some ways are even more important, I would say. So the internal experts, the people championing AI inside the organization, unintentionally create for them some sort of an echo chamber, right? They talk to each other. It's kind of like what's happening on LinkedIn. If you follow only AI experts, right? They assume their comfort level is the baseline for everybody. And then when time comes to scale to the frontline FSCs, they're genuinely surprised that field engineer doesn't relate to the tool the way they do. So the thing these teams need to internalize is that AI fluency is something that you build gradually, right? You build it through experience, through playing with the tools, through having some success stories or failing with it. You can't expect the frontline to arrive where experts already are. And trying to force that through training alone is actually one of the fastest way to lose them. So the advice is almost the opposite of what you would
Mm-hmm.
expect, actually. For a mature team, the recommendation would be to slow down on the building and invest more time on the discovery, on understanding the pain points first, and then kind of take it from there.
Yeah, no, I like it how sometimes you gotta push people towards the goal and build that confidence, and sometimes it's pulling them and say, hey, let's take a step back. We gotta get this right, and knowing when to do which. That's the art part of it.
Exactly.
I included this comment from John because I think it complements really well what you were just talking about, this habit loop, uh, and how once you're used to something, why it's so hard to get away from it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you might have an additional thought in there on that, but I um, sort of like a short follow up on this last group. I would expect that this build versus buy conversation, that's it always happens whenever there's technology. Um, that tends to get trickier when you have that talent in house, and there's this perception of, oh, we can do everything, right? So is and that doesn't need to be believed by everybody, but as long as there's a group that feels that they're better off keeping everything in house, then that could create a lot of friction for any partnership that is intended. Do you have any advice, any examples on how to either prevent or mitigate this kind of a behavior?
Yeah, it's interesting. It comes pretty often, and it's one of the most important patterns to recognize, because the friction is usually not what it looks like on the surface, right? I can share a story with this one. So we were working with a global medical technology organization. Highly technical team, extremely sophisticated people. And there was this project manager on the implementation who was keep pushing back at every turn, basically in every meeting, saying, stuff like the system was too complex. He was saying that demonstrating value would be nearly impossible. The conditions weren't right, stuff like that. So on the surface, it looked like an obstruction, right? But I've learned to, over the years, to listen a bit differently. So over time, through kind of subtle cues from other participants, I realized that apparently they previously attempted to build an internal AI solution, right? Right before we came in. So, and it failed, unfortunately. And this project manager was actually been very close to that effort that failed. And it actually, unfortunately, shaped how I now see every external partner who walked through the door. So once I understood that, my approach completely changed, because I realized it's not like resisting to the tool as a tool, right, or the system as a system. So I try to shift our entire focus to talking about the infrastructure and the
Mhm.
foundational requirements first. And the things he had lived through going wrong the last time actually shaped his expectations, um, because eventually he was trying to signal that he's not willing to repeat the same mistakes that he seen before. And
Mhm.
once it clicked for him, and I kind of tried to reassure him it's not going to happen again, he disarmed, basically, because he realized we're not going to repeat those mistakes. And that's usually the way to make sure, to make sure you have someone uh, to become
Mhm.
a committed advocate.
Yeah, no, great example. And scar tissue is a very real thing, and I'm sure many here will relate. Like with any bad relationship, it's hard to trust again, right? And thank you to Libby Healy on one of these comments, highlighting one of the things you said on the criticality of having a true problem to solve, having this highlighting the success stories. A heads up to our listening audience, we will go a couple of minutes over, but it would be criminal of me to cut short Adi. I want to extract as much as I can while she's here in the studio. So I'm sure you will appreciate this as well. So you talked a little bit about the differences. Briefly, are there any elements that are common regardless of where the organization's at, of little resources, a bunch of experts? Is there one or two things that are always necessary?
Yeah, there's one element that matters regardless of where an organization sits on the spectrum. If it's mature or immature, well resourced or lean, and that's visible manager behavior. You cannot go without it. And it's not just support from management, right? It's not sponsorship from managers, as we love to say. It's actually visible behavior from management. And it's important to distinguish because they get conflated constantly. So, it's important to remember that one session doesn't drive adoption. It just drives the illusion of adoption. And I want to give you just a quick example of what real management involvement looks like. So we were working with a global medical diagnostic organization. Again, extremely sophisticated team. Most of the companies that we're working with are relatively sophisticated, I gotta say, and highly skilled people. So we had deployed the system, we done the onboarding, run the initial training and everything, and then we started watching the usage data like we usually do. And it was flat, like week after week, we managed to achieve like 5%. And 5% isn't a technology problem, right? The platform was working and the data was there and the use cases were very clear, but 5% is actually a human problem. And what changed everything was a director of service who reached a turning point. So he actually took the time to truly understand the system. So not just what it was, but what it could do for his organization. And when that clicked for him, something shifted. So he didn't send just an email. He didn't delegate the next training session. He delivered that actually himself, end to end. Everything like opening remarks and the tone setting and actually live demonstration. And working with the system on real time on screen with his entire team watching him. Because when your director opens a laptop and uses a tool in front of you, two things happen simultaneously, right? First, you can no longer say it's complicated. He just proved you otherwise. And the second is that you understand that this is not optional. And there's a concept in psychology called social modeling. Maybe most of you are familiar with it, but it's taken from Bandura's social learning theory, which tells us that people form beliefs about what's possible by watching others, right? Especially people they respect. So a memo doesn't do that. A policy doesn't do that. But a director, live using the tool, that does. So usage didn't stay at 5% after this one.
Yeah,
the most powerful thing to remember is that your adoption tool isn't the technology, right? It's your manager opening the laptop and using it first. That's the actual adoption tool that you need.
Yeah, very powerful example. And just coming behind it with a bit of data that supports what you were saying, one of the interesting things that came out of the service leaders agenda is 2/3 of respondents saying that they didn't feel extremely confident. Again, didn't feel extremely confident about executing their service roadmap. And as we looked at the reasons and the difference between the group that was versus wasn't, the confirming what you talked about, visible support from above, but the other one was the horizontal alignment across organizations. The level of importance that took was much higher for those that were extremely confident. And I think what you called out is the key, that it needs to be visible. We might be on the same page, but if I don't know that, if I don't see that reflected in the metrics that you're using, in the message that you're communicating to the teams, in the data and the collaboration that you're proactively doing with me, then it's going to be very hard that we align across organizational boundaries. So again, really like that. Two final questions for you. One, we've sort of flirted around the idea of engagement with as part of the adoption process, and a question we get often is, hey, when and how many people should I engage when thinking about this to be successful? Is it always as early as possible? Is there a sweet spot? What have you learned along the way?
That's a very interesting question, actually. There is a sweet spot, and it's probably not what you would expect, unfortunately. So the instinct in most organizations is to front load everything, right? Engagement at kickoff, engagement at go live immediately, engagement in the first training. And all of that obviously matters, right? But in my experience, the most important engagement moment comes usually a couple of weeks after go live, after users had the chance to actually play with the tool a little bit, get to know it, and not before that. So before go live, people are listening to what you say, right, about the tool. And after go live, they're still forming their opinion about it. And that's where the real engagement conversation has to happen, because that's when people have something to react to. It's kind of like, having the theory exam before started driving. You need to start driving a little bit before you actually do that exam. This is like how I see that.
Yeah. For any teenagers listening out there, if there's any, remember, she did say a little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. Otherwise, John's is gonna be mad at me when his daughter uses this as a reference. No, but you're right. I remember this concept of drinking from a fire hose, and we've been getting a lot of that feedback from the Voice of the Frontline research. The close to 3,000 responses on field service technicians say there's too much knowledge. The install base has gotten way too complex. Trying to absorb all of that in the 2 weeks of onboarding, it's not working. Why are we still trying to do this as if we were in the 90s? And I think that applies to how we think about technology as well. It's a mini onboarding scenario. And lastly, this thinking about one of these other terms that gets thrown out commonly, and I don't think people always look under the hood of what it actually means. The idea of meeting people where they are. It tends to be used with customers, like, oh, we're going to meet them where they are. And more recently, and I'm glad that that the conversation is happening, but we need to put some substance behind it. What does it mean to meet the frontline where they are, and how does it connect to the adoption conversation that we've been having?
Yeah, so I think meet them where they are is one of those phrases, that gets used so often, it almost loses its meaning in some cases. But let me try to give you a concrete definition from the field, in my perspective. So the first part is actually kind of literal, right? You cannot understand what the frontline actually needs from a conference room. So I'm a big believer in ride-alongs, spending a day in the van or on site with the FSC, watching where the friction really, really happens. So what looks like a workflow problem from the executive floor is often might be a timing problem or missing knowledge problem, or just, my hands are full and I can't type problem. And you can only see that by being there. And the second part is hearing from every level of the organization. So, pain points don't just scale up the org chart clearly. What a field engineer struggles with is often invisible to their manager, and what the manager struggles with is often invisible to the director, right? So I like to run some roundtables across levels separately because people are more honest in their own peer group. And when you then design agents, like what we do in those roundtables, we try to figure out the pain points each level suffers from. And when you then design agents around the real needs that surface, adoption is almost automatic, right? Because people recognize themselves in the tool. But there's a third layer to that, and this is where the psychology comes in, and where they're at isn't only operational. It's actually also psychological, and there's a framework I find really useful from a recent Harvard Business Review article just came out I don't know, like 2 weeks ago, and they talk about 3 psychological needs that shape how people respond to AI. So it's their sense of competence, their sense of autonomy, and the sense of connection to their work. So same AI tool lands very differently on a 25-year veteran rather than a 6 months hire. Not because of age, and just because of each of them is being asked to renegotiate about their own role. And meeting them where they are means recognizing that and designing the conversation really around that.
Yeah. No, I like it, and I think I had seen the highlights of that. I'll go and read that full article. I was going to let you go, but we got a question from Henrik Black. I thank you for that. I believe you talked about this happening, this early adopters influencing the rest of the organization. Maybe to expand on that, the added question would be: is this something that you see often? That like there's a couple of people that usually start to get the ball rolling, and it creates a snowball effect.
Yeah, I do see that often, and it's extremely important when we have like pilots that convert to a full organization contract or scope. Usually they have a relatively good influence because those people eager to prove right something. So by having those early adopters, you manage to create success stories that then are being shared across the entire organization, and everybody want to be part of something successful, right? So those early adopters usually kind of set the level of where everybody else needs to be, and I think it's really good to have those because they kind of mark the signal or create the signal for all others that should be aligned to them.
And I would connect it to something you said earlier of how people believe in something, that once they see that somebody else is doing it and is succeeding at it, their own behavior changes and their concept of what's possible changes. Now, it does matter who is it that is this early adopter. When it is, doesn't have to be the title, but usually when it's people who are respected within the organization, who have this authority, not necessarily connected to the title, that tends to carry a lot of weight. So we do have to wrap this up at some point, sadly. But before I let you go, you've shared so much about the intersection between the psychological elements and the implementation of technology. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe some passion that you have outside of this, something that's coming up in the near term for you that excites you.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on something right now that I'm genuinely excited about. So I started kind of vibe coding an app. Yes, I'm obviously using AI for that, right? So that should help organizations to diagnose themselves in a way, what's actually preventing them from getting like the full value of the tools that the AI tools they've chose to adapt. Like I try to capture there the cultural factors, the communication patterns, and the management behaviors. Because what I've learned in 4 years of doing this work is that most adoption problems aren't visible on a dashboard, right? You cannot infer that from reading data or trying to analyze data. So they live actually in places that you don't usually get measured. And honestly, that's the same reason I gotta say I'm excited about something else coming on the calendar. June 10th, it's Field Service Edge 2026. So if this conversation resonates with you, you should be there. It's where the industry is coming together for exactly this kind of candid conversations about AI adoption, and what's actually working in the field. We have an exceptional lineup. So Shane Parrish, if you're familiar with him, is providing a keynote. And we will have practitioners from the organizations that we're working with, like Waters, Sandvik, Sativa, GLJ, and others, which actually, navigate AI adoption real time. So I'm planning to moderate this panel on AI adoption. So you should be there if you're interested in this kind of content.
Absolutely, that'll be fun. John Carroll, that you saw in the comments, my colleague, CEO, and founder of Service Council, he's going to be joining the conversations as well. So it's going to be a very exciting day for sure. Adi, once again, thank you so much. Thank you for listening and participating, audience. I'm sure you had as much fun and got as many notes as I was doing over here. Hope to see you in our next event, our full calendar, and have a great rest of the month. See you soon.